Greetings, folkaroos. It's Haley, and welcome back to another chess meetup recap. Now, this one's a little overdue because I've been having some stuff going on in my life right now. I'm prepping to go back to college, so things have been a little hectic. But I finally found time to make this video from last week's chess meet. So, without further ado, let's get into it. And when I came in, the first person I matched up against was this teenager who drives a truck. And in between last week and this week, I learned his name was Mason. But yeah, I played my first 3 games against him, and my only 3 games of the meet against him. So, I mean, besides like a timed game against Barry that I didn't write down because like I wanted to do good, and like you can't really write down blitz games while still doing good and having enough time. So yeah, these are the only 3 games that I had. So to fill the 5 games, I have a game that James played, and I also have a game that I played online. All right, so let's get into it. Let's kick on the review here. Right. So e4, c6, we get a Caro-Kann, and he plays the knight first, which usually is a way that white plays that when they want to play the exchange in a different way, with their knight already on f3. Instead of the standard exchange, where white puts the 2 pawns out like this, and then plays knight f3 here, and then black has the move. Basically, white gets this so that they can then play d4 and like bishop d3, and it's like a slightly different move order. I don't really know why it's that different, but yeah, instead of that he goes knight to c3, which is an invitation to play the 2 knights Caro-Kann. And how I like to play the 2 knights Caro-Kann is this and knight d7, which is an invitation to the Karpov Caro-Kann, which I've talked about before, where you want to put the knight here and take back with the knight instead of the pawn. But there's a couple different options that black could play here. Black could go bishop to g4 and play it kind of like this, pinning this knight, and then maybe playing like e6. Black could play knight f6 and sacrifice the damage to the pawn structure to get a pawn that controls this knight, and play usually looks something like this: d4, bishop d6. Like, black has a very standard scheme of development. They're going to put the bishop on d6, they're going to castle, and they're going to bring this knight to f8. So like this. That's usually what it looks like for black. This is a very systematic opening that's kind of easy for beginners to learn, but there are sacrifices. Like, it's very passive, and you'd make this damage to your pawn structure, so that's why I don't like to play it. Instead, I like to go for knight to d7 and then play knight to g to f6. But this game gets very funky very quickly, because after the knight trade, we get castles and bishop g4. And you know how I always talk about an undefended bishop pinning a knight from to queen from g4? Well, I was like, well, it's safe because it's guarded by the knight, but actually it's not safe at all. Audience moment. How can white take advantage of this move to win a piece? Or a pawn, actually. It's just a pawn in this instance, I believe. And if you're able to figure it out, the answer is bishop f7, which is what he played. And as soon as he played it, I was like, oh my god. Because if this, there is a double attack on the bishop with knight e5. And yeah, I just lose a pawn. But there was actually an even better way to go about it. Instead of bishop takes f7, he could have just played knight here and said, oh no, my queen. And it's not even a brilliant move because it's so obvious. Because if you take the queen, audience moment, where's the checkmate in one move? And if you're able to figure it out, the answer is bishop takes f7, knight guards this and this. But yeah, I blundered that, and I felt like a huge idiot. So I played e5, and he hit me with queen h5. And it's the same pattern as like I've talked about in videos previously. g6, queen e5, hitting this and this. So I didn't play g6. I had to play king to d7 to get out of the pin. And I was just basically accepting the fact that he would take. And then The computer wanted me to go for a queen trade and then, like, activate my bishop out like this, but I didn't wanna trade queens. Instead, I went king to d7, and after d3, audience moment, how can I protect this pawn and threaten a queen trade? And if you're able to figure it out, the answer is queen to e8, which is by far and away the best move in the position, because I defend the pawn, and if queens come off, which they do in the game, I have this pawn protected, and I'm only down a pawn, and I have good development, and my king is more active for the endgame. So it's a little bit closer, right? That's what happens in the game. We get bishop to e3, of course, hitting this pawn, so I play b6. Rook a to d1, just lining up on the king. He wants to push this pawn and try to open up the lines on my king, but I'm not about to let that happen. Push, he pushes again, and then I don't allow it to happen again. And now this pawn is just going to be a sitting duck for the rest of the game. So as you can see, I did get myself into a rough position because I forgot about that bishop thing, but I'm slowly starting to fight back, and this game is not going to be so simple for him to win. Pawn to c4. He's like, well, if I can't open things up, I'm at least going to lock my pawn in, which is a good decision. Then I go bishop to e5, attacking this pawn, forcing him to commit to this light squared structure. And right now, what this game is tending towards and why it's so bad for black is a same colored bishop endgame where white has a structure on the opposite color as my bishop, and I have a structure on the same color as his bishop, and I'm down a pawn. So that is why it's still extremely bad. But I am fighting back. Rook h to f8. I just bring my rook to the semi-open file, right? There's not really much else I can do here. So yeah, bishop to d4. And I'm basically asking this bishop, what does it want to do? Does it want to take and give me two very powerful pawns in the middle of the board? Does it want to stay there? And if I take, then rook takes, which is not good for black. But he decides to take. And I'm almost completely back in the game because these pawns are way too powerful. And if he tries to attack this, I just push d3. And then I can play like this, or I can double the rooks on this pawn. And then I can bring my king up and pressure the base of this pawn chain. So things are starting to look up a little bit. Rook f to e1. But in this position, I decided to play rook f4, which it does get me into like a funny spot later. He could have played f3 in this position. Obviously, I can't push because then I just lose this pawn. And if I take, then takes, and rook d3, and this is just absolutely a non-starter for black. Like white's going to win this at like most levels. But rook e3, and then I double up. I double up in this position. What I should have apparently done was play b5. And if takes, it splits the pawns and it also opens up the C file. So then I could invade over here and pressure from another angle and hit this pawn. And also this structure is very, very hard to deal with. But instead I go here, I double up. Well, I'm tired. But yeah, I attack this pawn and then I start to get a little careless, king d6, and yeah. So, audience moment, how can white deflect my rook from defending this pawn in two pawn moves? And if we're able to figure it out, the answer is g3, and if I try to stick around, then h3, and then he just picks up the pawn. And I'm down 2 pawns, but g3, and then I go rook to f3, expecting him to take. I'm expecting him to take, and then I'm expecting him to go back here and try to pick everything up. But he takes, I go king c5, he goes back, and then I go here. This is a little bit of a tricky moment for white. There's only one good move in the position. Audience moment, what is the only good move in this position? And if you're able to figure it out, the answer is not this. Because rook and king see that, so takes would be the result. And it is not rook takes rook, which is what he did in the game, because after this, I hold on to the pawn, and then my king can invade via c3, hit the rook, push the pawn, and then maybe get to the base of this pawn chain. The answer is rook d takes d3, because not only do you hit the king while defended and you don't give the rook a chance to take, you're also going to take this rook and just win a full rook. But he plays this, attacks me, and then I just play king to c3. I force him back, king to c2, and then I take the open file. I'm ready to give a check. I'm fully back in the game, and I'm almost winning here. Rook f2 check. And I could play d2, but I didn't want to pin myself, so I played rook to e2. And I win the game. Wait, apparently, if I went here, right, instead of blocking with the rook, if I went there, then he could have checked me, and I can't block with the pawn, so I have to come down. Rook f2, king d1, then d2. And this is actually kind of funny because I'm going to step out of the way. He's going to sacrifice the rook, and I have a rook and 4 pawns, and he has 7 pawns. But this d pawn is going to be very dangerous. So this is not an endgame that I wanted to simplify into. So instead, he takes, and then he goes here and here, and I win the game after this. Check and this. And that is how that ended. Because he cannot stop my pawn because my king is right there. He can't stop it. And that was how our first game went. And then moved on to play the second game against him on different colors. And this time I played the white pieces. Now, this game was not really too great for me. So yeah, I started with e4, and then guess what he plays, guys? Guess what he plays? He plays knight f6. This is what James plays against this. e4, queen takes. Now this is a sideline because you normally don't want to do this because then your queen can get hit by a knight. And what James does here is that he does this, right? And then after knight f3, he then either goes c5 or knight c6, and then when the knight moves and queen takes, that would be a thing, right? Because normally, like, if the knight isn't on f3 and the knight is on c6, the queen can take here, and this won't happen because this is attacked twice by knight and queen. But yeah, that's just not the case here. So I can play knight c3, queen a5, and then I just develop my pieces. And I'm like, well, what's your justification for this? And we get into a pretty funky line. I didn't even know this was a line. Bishop f5. I break the pin and I threaten to move the knight and attack the queen. He plays c6, which is a standard move in the Scandinavian, opening up a retreat square for the queen. Audience moment. What is the most effective way to create a threat against this queen with the bishop, right? What is the most effective move that you can do? And if you're able to figure it out, the answer is knight e4. Because if you'll notice something, the queen is attacked. And if the queen goes back, I can take and damage the structure because queen to d8 did not defend it because the pawn was still on e7. So I have this damage to the pawn structure, and then I play c3, just getting out of the way of the bishop. Bishop e7, bishop c4. I just activate. It's normally good to put your bishop here in e4 openings because it just pressures the weakest pawn on the board. Castles, castles, bishop d6. So what essentially Mason is trying to do here is he's trying to activate this battery and then maybe play bishop to g4 to take and be able to take that without the knight guarding it. So in order to stop bishop to g4, I play pawn to h3. Then he goes king to h8. Just, I have no clue why he went there because this pawn is light years away from being able to move, even if it wasn't pinned. Rook to e1. And then he plays a very, very aggressive move. He's like, well, if I can't play bishop to g4, I'm going to try to play pawn to g5 to go g4. Audience moment, folks. There is no way, like, you're going to see this if I just say audience moment here. So I'm just going to show you the first move. The first move is knight to h4. Attacking the bishop. obviously hanging the knight. If the bishop goes back to e6, then bishop e6, pawn e6, and then knight back to f3, and this is a big damage to the pawn structure. But if black takes, audience moment, how can white create a huge threat on the king? Damn it, uh I just hit the click with my other hand there. But yeah, I did kind of spoil it here, but can you see the idea behind it? And if you're able to figure it out, queen f3, and then if the bishop moves, look what's behind the pawn, or behind the bishop. Queen takes, and then bishop h6. And you cannot stop that checkmate. But instead, I play queen to b3, just trying to target that pawn. Not the best move. G4 is played, allowing knight h4 again. But I play bishop h6. I decided to get tactical with him, which was a mistake because he calculated for like 5 to 7 minutes here for like a decently long chunk of time, and he came up with the fact that he could sacrifice his rook. Because if I took bishop to h2, king f1, and pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn wasn't even the right move. The right move was knight to d7. It was knight to d7. And if the bishop moves out of the way, b5, trapping the bishop, forcing it to take the pawn. And if it takes the pawn, bishop to d3, forcing me to sack my rook and then go king to e1. Bishop c4, right? Attacking the queen. And if I take and convert on a pawn, f takes g2 and that pawn is promoting. I can't stop it. That would be a disgusting way to lose. But yes, instead of like if we go back here after bishop h2, I had to play king h1 because then the best move would have been this, knight to d7, and then I could have played bishop to h6. Excuse me, rook to g8. Then I could have gone king to h1, and there's really no attack on my king, and I'm still up 2 pieces. So he would have played bishop takes here, trying to threaten that, and then I would have had to give my rook away. I would have had to give my rook away on the g1 square, and I would have been surviving, basically. But I play king to f1, which just blunders knight to d7 and that whole continuation earlier. But he plays this. And after takes, he plays queen f4. The correct follow-up after this was to play knight to d7 because after this, then rook to g8 would have been possible. Knight d7 just clears the back rank for the rook to come and check the king. But after queen to f4, I have an absolutely insane move that I can play. Bishop to d6. Just giving back the piece completely to then take on b7. That is how I would have had to come back into the game. Queen f4, I play rook h1. I'm like, okay, I'm double attacking. Audience moment. How can he take advantage of this move? And if you're able to figure it out, the answer is this. Check. And not even taking the rook. He goes here, threatening checkmate. And there's nothing I can do. I can't play queen to c2. I can't defend this with a bishop because it's all the way over here. If I play f3, then queen f3 and queen f2. So the only way that I can defend, and this is a ridiculous continuation. Rook h2. This is the only way I can save it for now. Bishop takes. Bishop d6, sacrificing the bishop back to play this, not even taking on b7. Then knight to d7, first brilliant move. Sacrificing this to play f5 and hit the rook. Then rook e1, rook to g8, threatening this. So you allow it, but there's still a square here, and you play this to stop a check on that file by the queen or anything. Then second brilliant move, knight to c5, sacrificing that piece because taking it opens up a check. Audience moment. What is the most devastating check? Can you find it, the mate in 2 here? And if you're able to figure it out, it's queen to d3. And the king is frozen. So this, And then nothing to do with the queen. You can't go here. You can't take the rook. So, boom. And now the rook blocks the only escape path that would have been there if the queen wasn't there. And that is how the game ended. I resigned after bishop g3, but those are the several ways that the game could have ended. And because our series was 1-1, we played a tiebreaker. And let us hop into that game. We played a tiebreaker, and I got the white pieces again. And this was a better game. This was a much better game. I played at 85% accuracy, which is not like crazy good, but it's definitely something. So e4, and then we get this same thing, knight f6, and I decide to play it a little bit differently. I play knight f3 first. I play knight f3 first, and then he does a mistake. He plays e6. He's trying to win my pawn back with a pawn. But this is a very useful and instructive pattern that I can teach you guys. Whenever there's a pawn here and an open a4 to e8 diagonal, there is a very powerful check that you can play. Audience moment. Can you find that check? And can you find why it's a good move to play in this circumstance? And if you're able to figure it out, the only check you can give is bishop to b5. And the reason why this is good is because you're using this pawn while it's still here, right? If c6 then takes and takes and you're up a pawn, all you have to do is move your bishop back to e2. He's blocking his own knight development square, right? And it's just looking really good for you. If he blocks with the bishop, looking to get takes, takes, and take the pawn back, well, all you have to do is take, and then take. And you're still up a pawn. So whenever you see a pattern like this with a pawn here and an open diagonal, you can play bishop to b5 check and win a pawn. So that's kind of useful knowledge to have. But yeah, bishop to a4 was slightly inaccurate. Like I said, bishop to e2 was the better move because after bishop to a4, bishop to a6 can be played, restricting castling rights. And if d3 is played to just kind of shut that down, he has a tricky move queen f5. And now there are two ways to stop this while defending the bishop. One, and the one I played, is knight c3. Audience moment. What is the other way that this check can be defended while defending the bishop? And if you're able to figure it out, the answer is pawn to c3, getting in the way and opening up a protection on the bishop. This is actually a rather common motif, the queen's defense of something on a4 when the queen is checking here, right? Knight to c3, because he thinks after knight to c3, he's got bishop to b4, and he's winning his pawn back fair and square, which he is. But it's really not as bad for me as he might think, because I can just go here, because of course I don't want my bishop to get the defense taken away from under it. Bishop takes, takes, and takes is a check, yes, and it seems to fork the rook and the king. But there's bishop to d2, knocking the queen back, and for the price of a pawn, I get big development and I castle. And who's better here if not white? Like, I can't really tell you why black would think to do that. Castles, and I notice queen and rook on the same diagonal, so I play e3, trying to prepare bishop to b4. It's always good to like train your tactical vision, like, oh, when two things of importance are on the same diagonal, how can I win them, right? But in this case, it's a bad move because the queen can just shift over to h5, and if bishop to b4 is played, then c5, defended by the queen. But he goes queen to b6, just getting out of the way. Like after, I think I mentioned this in the last video, or maybe I didn't. Maybe I just mentioned it in passing to my uncle. But Mason here likes to mutter to himself and whisper to himself while he plays chess. So after I played a3, he was like, "Man, that's a good move. How can I get out of that? Okay, she's gonna do this, so I'm gonna get out of the pin like this." So that's what he does, right? And in this game, I was able to pick up on some of those mumblings to kind of figure out what he was going to do in the future. Bishop to e3 attacks the queen. He moves, and I play queen to d2. Just, linking up queen and bishop, linking up the rooks, and my position is working in harmony. He plays knight to d5, right? He goes knight to d5, and I think he just wants to get rid of my bishop. So I don't let him. I attack the rook. He goes here. He's like, yeah, I'm lining up the rook on the queen, so maybe I can like start pushing this pawn. And I'm like, well, okay, that's not scary at all. C4. And like, by the way, what he should have done here was play knight to d7. Oh, that's kind of funny because you trade pieces, right? That you trade pieces. But neither of us saw that. Knight to b6 was played, and then I played this, defending the bishop, and he's like, "Oh wow, I could play like knight back to d7. I could trap the bishop, but also that pawn is hanging, so I'm just gonna take the pawn." So he took the pawn, and that was apparently a very bad move because I could have played queen to c2, double attacking the knight. Where you're like, "Well, Haley, knight back to b6." You turn the tables on him. Knight to g5. And you notice bishop, queen, knight, other bishop, all aiming towards that king. So g6 would have to be played, and then knight e6 and bishop takes e6, and the attack is pretty dang strong. But yeah, I didn't see that. And instead, I just lost a pawn. And now I went from being up a pawn to being down a pawn. Rook f to c1. This was the lowest point in the game for sure. He goes bishop to a6 because he just wants to stay on this diagonal. It looks optically really powerful. I don't blame him. But here I start to go on a almost perfect tactical attack. I've made all my mistakes. Just look at the rest of this game, right? This is from him. Look at the rest of my moves. No mistakes, only great moves, best and excellent. I start to go on an almost perfect attack from this point on. Queen to g5, right? I go queen to g5, just getting next to the king, right? Knight to d7, attacking the bishop. I defend the bishop with the queen. Well, the pawn already defends it. And if knight takes, then I take the queen, right? I pin the knight. Then rook 8 to c8. And then after that, how can you create a big threat? You might be thinking, well, you could play this, but that doesn't work here because knight takes c5, clearing up defense of that because the rook defends the queen, right? That doesn't work. So bishop to d6 is the only way to continue the attack because after this, now knight g5 and queen f5. Audience moment, can you find the sacrifice that I did? Well, it's not really a sacrifice, but can you find the quote unquote sacrifice that I did here that continues the attack and exploits the way that these pieces are together, but not actually like properly defending each other? And if you're able to figure it out, the answer is rook takes c6 because if this, then this. The answer to what I should have done in this position was bishop c7. And after rook to e8, take, take. And that was what I should have done. But um, after bishop c7, boom, 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 boom. Right. So yeah, yeah. So back here. What black should have done after rook takes c6 was play bishop b5. Because then takes and takes, and this is defended, and this is defended. And now black is just doing very fine. But he takes. Because I think he was like, "Oh, I can block with the knight," but no, that's just checkmate. And as soon as I took, he resigned. And I was just like, "Wow, I went on a very nice attack there." So I finished my games, and there was about 15 minutes remaining in the meet. So I looked at, James writes his games down just like I do, and I look at the notes for this game, which went for the whole meet. He Ron and James were playing this game for the whole meet. So Ron, if you don't know who Ron is, he's like the guy that apparently was here before I came regularly. He came regularly like some months ago when I was still in school, and he is a military veteran, and he literally came in there wearing like his army jacket with his name on it, with like his nameplate and like dog tags and stuff. Like it was pretty cool. I was like, man, you don't want to mess with this guy. And apparently he was a good chess player. So Chuck was like, well, why don't you guys match up against each other? This was a battle for the ages. And oh boy, did it not really disappoint. But let's get into it. So Ron, as it turns out, is a player of the Birds opening. And what the Birds opening is, this is literally named after a guy named Bird who liked to play f4. Like he liked to play the King's Gambit, right? But he didn't want to include this pesky e4, e5 just gaining control of the center. He wanted to play f4, just opening up the diagonal and not putting any center pawns in the board. So James is just like, okay, d5. This is the most principled move against the Bird's opening, just gaining control of the center and preventing e4. Knight f3, knight f6, e3. This is some very, very standard stuff. In the Bird's opening, this bishop tends to get a little shut out by playing f4, so white basically commits to this structure, and sometimes white likes to develop the bishop out like this. I don't play it because I think it's like very awkward to play like this, and I think black just has a very easy game, just like doing stuff like c5, knight c6, bishop f5. And James actually does that. He plays c5, which is known as the Lasker variation. He could have also played bishop to f5, like kind of forcing white to make this decision with their pawn structure and try to repel that bishop, and then e6, opening up that bishop, right? Then c5 and knight c6. This is how I would have played it if I were James, but listen to me trying to coach James, right? It's ridiculous. c3 is played by him, by Ron here, trying to go d4. James just plays knight to c6, d4, and e6. If takes would be a very bad positional decision by white because you are giving up a center pawn. Black has two center pawns and a 3 against 1 development edge, as well as the pawn on the d file, right? Like this semi-open d file is actually kind of bad for white because it has like some weak squares here. And this would just be a very disastrous sort of thing for white. Like if they just tried to develop like normal castles, castles, queen to b6, even like that, all the pressure is just gonna mount, right? So c3, knight c6, d4, e6, bishop e2. Ron is just developing his pieces. Bishop to d6. This bishop is a very important piece against the Bird's opening because Ron has committed all of his structure to the dark squares. And if you simplify into an endgame, this pawn is going to become very weak. Castles, castles, knight e5. This is another key idea of the Bird's opening, as well as the London opening. You put a knight on e5, stopping black from ever being able to play e5 himself. This is a main idea because if black is able to play e5 safely, then you are basically losing because the whole idea of the opening is to create this like grip on that square. Queen to c7. And by the way, taking is not a good idea here because if this knight takes, then this pawn takes with a fork and opens up the rook. And if the bishop takes, then excuse me, that would have been silly. But yeah, here and then knight e4. And this pawn might be a little bit weak. Also, knight to d2 could just be played to trade his most active piece. Like, it's not pretty, right? Knight e5, queen c7. And we get knight df3 here. And the reason why this is bad is a very kind of esoteric reason. It's that black can just play knight to e7 and basically say, this knight isn't doing anything. It doesn't have any targets. And I'm going to rotate around to f5 and put more pressure on your center pawn. And then I'm going to play bishop to b7, right? It's just essentially what it's saying, like, hey, you know the prized possession of your position? It's misplaced. You don't have any targets, bro. But James doesn't do that. Instead, he plays knight e4, getting his own powerful knight in the center of the board. Ron plays bishop to d3, always maintaining the option to take that knight if times get tough. Then bishop takes e5. This I'm not sure about by James. I don't know why he decided to cash in on the knight right now. Because, yeah, like I said, this just opens up, and queen to c2 could be played in the future, just threatening to maybe win a pawn here and activate on the light squares. Like, I think this was a bit of a weird decision by James, but it turns out his justification for that was to play pawn to f5 and lock in the knight. And for the life of me, I don't know why Ron did not go en passant. Maybe he just didn't like this. He thought that he was kind of not achieving anything, but I would have gone Either queen I would have maybe thought about queen to c2. I would have maybe thought about queen e1, like rotating around to attack like this. I would have thought about rook e1, maybe to try to play this, maybe taking, maybe knight to g5. There's a lot of different moves here. But after f5 instead of en passant, one plays b3. Audience moment. What is wrong with that move? And if you're able to figure it out, it drops the c3 pawn very simply. And after queen to c2, the f5 pawn shuts out anything. Like, if, for example, James had played f6, then b3, then this would have been not a great idea because queen to c2 hits the knight and hits the pawn. But in that case, there would have been knight e4, giving back up the pawn to then play bishop b7 and line up on the queen. But, just the principle is right. Knight there, and then he goes knight e4. This knight is now even more powerful because he's up a pawn, and this battery is completely blocked, as well as he's controlling some squares around the king. This bishop's development is kind of like the only good thing for this bishop to do here would be going to a3 and pinning that pawn to the rook. That's literally the only use it has. But Ron just completely gets very desperate and takes the knight. Now, this is a terrible idea because what happens is you just get this huge pawn mass moves forward. The rook opens. If knight to g5 is played, rook f1, king f1, h6, kicking the knight back, and knight h3 would have to have been played, then cd4 and this. Or wait, never mind. Yeah, then queen f7, right? Queen f7 and then this. And like you're just going to go down another pawn. Your knight is on the side of the board and you have nothing else to show for this position. Via f takes e4, he goes knight to d2, and James is like, "Hey, I'm not going to take you on your terms, buddy. I'm going to force you to take me or get off of the file and let me have this square for the rest of the game." And Ron is like, "Yeah, I'm not doing that. I'm going to take. And then I'm going to play bishop to a3, pinning the pawn." But James is just like, "Okay, you can go ahead and do that." Audience moment, what was the better move for James here? How could James have tried to attack the king with two pieces? And if you're able to figure it out, the answer is queen f7, attacking that square. And this, if this were to have been played, then that bishop is still there, right? So you can't do that. So king has to step aside. Then queen f2, pinning the knight to the queen to d1, getting out of the pin, and then queen takes c3, and the invasion continues, right? Bishop to d3, using the anchor pawn to attack the queen. This is still a fine move. Queen to c3. Here comes the pawns. Instead of even taking the pawn back and splitting everything, he plays this. Clearly the better move, looking to fork. Bishop b2, pawn to b4, takes, and now James is just up a clean pawn. Queen to e1. There's not really much for white to do in this position. Like, this is their only asset. So he's going to move here, and then he's going to put the rook behind the pawn, and he's going to try to use the queen to get that pawn upwards. d4, rook c1, we get rook defending the pawn. c6 is played, right? Queen to d5. Black has to pay some attention to this pawn. And for the life of me, I don't know why Ron didn't play this. I think Ron didn't play c7 because he thought queen to d7 was bad. But he could have played this, right? He could have played this. Queen d4, king h1. And then if queen back to d7, you could take on e4. And actually, in this position, white is winning because after this sequence of trades, um, there's knight c5 in this position, hitting this and this. And if the queen tries to stick around, knight takes d3 here and here. So there are still very much ways in which this could go wrong for James, but Ron takes. Ron takes and then invites that check. Rook to c7, just blockading the pawn for all eternity. Queen to g3, great move attacking the rook. Pawn to e5, getting in the way. Queen to g4, this is a mistake. Apparently, Ron should have played h3 in this position because after queen to g4, black can take. And you may be like, well, Haley, that just gives up a full rook. Audience moment. Where's the checkmating move? How do you initiate mate here? And if you're able to figure it out, the answer is queen to a1, taking advantage of the weakened back rank. And blocks, blocks, and blocks will not stop because they all block different squares, right? There's no team up. But queen to d6, James just is like, all right, I'm going to pick up this pawn. Like, it's over. Like, we get a queen attack, which, this might be a bit uncomfortable, but we don't get that. Knight c4, bishop takes c4. James just eliminates that and then starts pushing the pawn. He doesn't even take. He's like, well, I can take this any old time I freaking want to take it. I'm going to start pushing this pawn. Queen to e2 from Ron. Blundering queen to d2. This takes, and rook takes pawn. And now James is just up 2 pawns in an endgame. You can't defend this without letting this push. And then if he takes, then that takes. And then you have this, and it's just really bad. H3. And yeah, we just have a bunch of endgame moves. They shuffled their kings around for like 10 years in this endgame. Rook b2, king e6. He sacrifices a pawn to go rook to c2 and pick up another pawn. And if you defend, this just goes through. So rook e3 has to be played. Yep, you just lose the pawn, check. It doesn't matter how advanced the king and rook are getting. There's just too many threats that black has. Rook h2, king f5, pawn to g6. And then here's where my transcription of the game kind of cut off a little bit because I was trying to write this game while I was playing another one. Because in this position, after king to g3, I have James playing h5, which he definitely didn't play. But I can tell you from the rest of this game, all they did was basically shuffle their kings around until Ron picked up this pawn, but traded it for that one, and then it was two against king and rook, and then he just managed to win, of course, right? And that is the last game I have for you from the meet. But to meet the 5 games, I have another crazy game that I played online on the last day of my road trip against this fellow named Big Man KKGG. Like a lot of kilograms because he's a big guy, right? Oh man, this game was ridiculous. I mean, it was a 10-minute game, and as you can see here, I pulled it directly from chess.com, so we have the time consumption, so we can kind of, use that to analyze as well. But we get a Caro-Kann, and we get knight c3, and this is automatically looking like another game that I played, right? We get knight to d7, but this is definitely the more, like, usual kind of thing that happens here in the Karpov, right? If bishop to d3 takes, black targets the bishop, and then queen to d3 is a strange move. The usual move played here is bishop to d3, just maintaining this, right? And it's actually rather difficult for black to play here. Bishop to g4 here, e6. White can play something like c3, and then black has to find queen to c7, preventing bishop f4, and then setting up this diagonal to prepare to take. It's kind of complicated. Queen to d3, however, is not good because apparently the computer thinks that the following continuation is extremely strong for black. I don't really know why. I guess it's because you can play e6 bishop here and then like get developed. But yeah, I didn't want to do that. I just played bishop to g4, knight to e5. This is looking similar again to that game that I played. Knight e5 attacking the bishop, and I'm like, you know what? E6. Go ahead, take my damn bishop, man. Like I really don't care. If you're gonna play h3, I'm gonna go back here and target this. Like who cares, man? F3 though. He makes me go back here, and then he plays this, and then he grabs that with the bishop, which I thought was a very, very odd decision because I was looking to play a move like queen to d5 and knight d7 in the future to try to trade this and then maybe take on f3. Also, my rook is open on this pawn. I thought it was just pretty strong. Bishop to d2, queen to b6. I'm attacking this. And of course, bishop to c3 would defend, both things, but I think he didn't like knight to d5 in that position. I should have played bishop to d6 because after queen to here attacking the pawn, right? This hits the knight and then I can't defend the pawn. That's the idea. Queen to c7, defend the pawn, double attacking the knight. He can castle. Oh wait, no, he can't castle. His best move is long castles. His best move is this, because if this, then there would be this. But if he short castles, takes, if queen to b7, audience moment. Find the checkmate in one move that wasn't present when he castled the other way. Why can't he do this? Where's the checkmate? And if you were able to figure it out, queen h2. Did you forget about this rook? I hope you didn't, because now you're checkmating the king. But yeah, queen to b6, targeting the pawn. He long castles anyway. Bishop d6. And then he decides to sacrifice his knight. The big man, kilogram big man, decides to sacrifice his knight over here for 2 pawns. But I just move my king over and I defend this, and I'm like, look, I think I'm doing all right. h4, you could attack as much as you want. I'm just going to take. Oh boy. Takes. Audience moment. What's the best move for black? How can they take advantage of this queen move? And if you're able to figure it out, the answer is bishop to g5, attacking this and double attacking the knight. And if I like just move out of the way, for example, bishop f6 and queen f6. And if I play king to g8, it's even more over because queen takes e6. And oh boy, this is not fun. But h5, he plays h5. He tries to attack with pawns, and he lets me play this, which I don't play. I play bishop to e5, just, superficially setting up checkmate. And he's like, ha 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 ha, I got you. And this one's really complicated. The reason why this isn't good is because this takes. And if he tries to attack with a pawn, then I can take with the rook. He could have played c3. And if queen to c5 and h6, he still has his dark squared bishop. So I can't take with the rook. That's the difference there. So bishop to c3. Instead, I play queen f4, allowing bishop back to d2 to block, but he goes king to b1, making me convert, and I'm like, haha, I grabbed a pawn. I grabbed a pawn, you idiot. I am the best chess player ever. Hold on, let me turn my brightness up a little bit. Right. Audience moment, what's the best move here for white? And if you're able to figure it out, the answer is this. Rook h to f1 attacking the queen. Because if the queen moves to, like, say here, rook d7. And that's an unstoppable threat. By the way, if this were to be played, yeah, rook takes f6 will still be fine. But queen takes c3, defending the knight, and there's no rook d7. So it's just a complete draw. So you had to play the right rook there as white. But I took with the pawn. I took with the pawn, completely forgetting that the rook could come over and x-ray me. But he does it with the other rook, which is perfectly fine in this instance. Check. And then he chases me with queens and rooks across the board, and then the queen e7 check, which just allows me to shelter myself on b6, and it's a complete draw. What he should have done here, right, was play rook to f3. He should have gone here, attacking the queen. And if this, then queen e7, then rook to b3, and this is how you would continue the attack. But queen to e7 allows me to do this and then trade the queens! Because if I didn't trade the queens, the threat was to take on b7 with check, and if I went here, then rook to d3 and rook to b3. So I played queen to b4 to force the queens off, and I'm just up a pawn. Like, he can't attack me with not a lot of pieces, right? Here. I defend the pawn. He goes here, boom, and I do hang this, but it's actually not that bad because I go here, and here, and it's still 2 on 3 over here. So I still have a chance. C4, and you may be like, "Well, this game is kind of normal. Why did you include this?" You'll see. Rook e5, forcing the pawn forward, and then c5, forcing the king back. Now, I could continue to give checks, but instead I go rook to g5, and then I might swing around over here. Check was check on the king, so I couldn't take the pawn. So then he moves down. He's 1 square away from queening, but it's not scary because he can't give me a check while also covering this square. So king takes a4. What he could have tried here was to maybe sneak around like this and try to give me a checkmate like that. but rook to G3 would have just been absolutely devastating there, and then rook takes G7, because then after check I had this, but rook to H6 he plays, just completely giving up the pawn. Also, funny continuation here. After this, he could have promoted to sacrifice my rook and then take this. Rook G3, I could have chased the king all the way up the board. But then if he is a little careless on how he hunts down the pawns, this could happen, and I could be completely winning, but unfortunately that didn't happen. Rook H6 takes. He tries to swing around like this, and if I tried to, like, push pawns here, then I get mated in one move, which is not pleasant. So king to A5, I get out of that. King B6, check. King C6, he has no more checks. I'm completely winning, right? Rook to G3, I try to go here. B5, I get the trade. It looks like I'm just gonna be able to convert this to victory, but it's actually not so simple. Because although I get my king up, I play this a little inaccuracy, C4, allowing the rook in here, and I can't go up, so I have to go back. And the king is a little bit too active, and it's hard for me to push the pawns, because when I do push the pawns, the king is gonna be able to nestle himself on C3, and the rook is cutting me off from getting involved, so it's actually kind of difficult to win. So I kind of panic here because I have less than a minute. King to C3. I'm playing all these moves super quick. He lets my king get up, which I was happy to see. No more checks. And then he gets desperate. He does this. And I have rook and king versus king. Obviously, this is winning, but watch what happens. You know in chess how there's a rule where 3 times you repeat the position and it's a draw? Well, 1, 2, 3. And I repeat the position accidentally because I got a little bit confused in my extremely low time about the best way for me to go about this. King to B2, I should have played here, and then this, and then here, 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 here. Then I should have played this. You just have to cut the king's box even more. Here, king C3, here, king B3, king A1, and checkmate. That's how that should have ended, but I got a little careless because here I was like, well, he can attack my rook. I have to go back, right? Or no, I don't have to go back. I just move the rook back because if he goes here, then I go here. There's no way I can repeat the position here. King here. All right, time to start closing the box again. King to B2, and instead of doing this, I go here. Oh boy, folks, have you ever accidentally repeated 3 times? Like, I really hope I never do that again because that was legitimately really embarrassing. That was the last night of my road trip on an online game after I finished working. Oh boy, I've been the amazing Haley, and I will see you in the next video.